All right, it looks like our numbers have stabilized there, so we will get started tonight. So welcome everybody. My name is Robin Rush and I'm an engagement and education specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks. I'll be facilitating this evening's session and we have a great presentation planned for you this evening to share information about the science behind your hunting license and how recreational harvest is allocated in Alberta each year. So in the spirit of reciprocity and truth, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of Treaty 7 this evening. And as we're coming together online, we are dispersed across the traditional territories and homelands of many Indigenous peoples. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the territories of Treaties 4, 6, 8, and 10, and the long histories and deep connections that First Nations and Métis have with this land. I honor this tonight in hopes of connection and continuing to work together in good ways. So we are going to go through a couple of housekeeping items here before we move into our presentation about the science behind your hunting license. Then we'll take a couple of moments to introduce you to our panelists that you see on screen this evening and the subject matter experts that will be answering some of your questions in tonight's question and answer period. So we are scheduled to run straight through until 8:30, which means we have about an hour to answer as many questions as possible about how recreational harvest is derived each year. That being said, there is quite a large group of us online tonight, so I do want to give you a heads up that we may not be able to respond to all of the questions that come in. But for the question and answer period, we will be using the Q&A tool in Zoom. So if you're joining from a computer, that Q&A button will show up in your toolbar, either at the bottom or the top of your screen. And if you're joining from a phone or a tablet, that toolbar might again be at the top of your screen or located along the left-hand side. So you can go ahead and open up that Q&A tool now if you want to. And once you do, you'll see that you'll be able to start typing out any questions that you have there. So another feature we'll be using tonight is the upvoting button. So it's that thumbs up button that will appear once questions start to come in. So if you do see a question that you have as well or would like to hear an answer to tonight, you can click that thumbs up and it will take that question higher up in our list and help us to prioritize the questions that we answer this evening and the order that they are answered in. Now, for our Q&A, there are a couple of ground rules tonight. So we will be combining similar questions or questions about the same topic and provide an answer more holistically so we can answer as many different questions as possible this evening. Any questions that are coming in that have already been answered, we will be dismissing as well. And last but not least, anything that's inappropriate will be deleted. So let's do our best to keep it clean tonight. I know that many of you have also taken the time to respond to the recent engagement survey on wildlife management and the vision for recreational hunting. So thank you for doing that. Your comments have actually been used to plan tonight's session, as well as the education session we hosted last week on the topic of hunting allocations in Alberta. And if you missed that one last week, you can still watch a recording of it on Alberta Environment and Parks YouTube. And we will share a link to that later in tonight's presentation here. Now, as you can see, we do have a panel of environment and park staff online tonight, and we will hold off on introductions, as I mentioned, until after our presentation. We'll go through who's who so you know who you're asking questions to in the Q&A portion tonight. But for the time being, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Mike Russell. Mike is a senior wildlife biologist with Alberta Environment and Parks. And so with that, I will pass it over to Mike now to take us through our presentation here.
Thanks for that, Robin. Do I have control here?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So tonight I will provide a general overview of the process of harvest allocation through the issuance of hunting opportunity through licenses in Alberta. The intent is to provide an introduction to the foundation of the allocation process and a better understanding of the approach in Alberta. Alberta has a large number of wildlife management units, game species, and license opportunities, and provides one of the most desirable hunting environments in North America. I'm presenting to you today, but there are a number of biologists across the province that contribute to the allocation cycle that we're going to be exploring this evening. So today we're going to walk through the allocation cycle, or the process that we use to allocate special licenses for big game in Alberta. We're going to describe the importance of aerial ungulate surveys for big game management. And we're also going to introduce how the Hunter Harvest Survey directly informs big game license numbers and how the information provided by hunters is directly used to calculate our license allocation. And finally, we're going to walk through a simple calculation to demonstrate how the number of special licenses are calculated for a special license opportunity. Before we get into it, we want to talk a bit about allocation and what that is. So Alberta offers a diversity of licensed hunting opportunities for a large number of species, seasons, and experiences. And when I refer to allocation today, I'm speaking to the process of determining the number of animals to be harvested in a given year in a given WMU by license type. One example of that is general licenses for big game, and they're available when harvest does not exceed sustainable harvest levels, or harvest rates rather, and where all management objectives can be satisfied with highest opportunity. For example, white-tailed deer hunting opportunity is managed under a general license throughout most of Alberta. In contrast to general licenses, special licenses are typically implemented when harvest rates exceed sustainable levels or when management objectives cannot be achieved with general license opportunity. And special license opportunities require hunters to enter a draw. And within that draw, licenses are typically assigned based on a system of hunter priority. So many are probably familiar with that. Most draws are priority-based in Alberta, meaning that when hunters are unsuccessful in getting drawn, they increase in priority by 1 point for the following year. And I should mention that there are a handful of draw opportunities that are lottery-based in Alberta, but most of them are priority-based. Based on some good feedback in last week's public forum, for those of you that attended, I want to clarify that we throw around a lot of jargon that can be confusing with respect to licenses and licensing. So just to clarify, when others refer to special licenses, limited entry, special licenses, tags, and permits, we're generally talking about the same thing, which is typically a single license opportunity. For the intents and purposes of today, we'll be speaking to special license opportunity, which is the licenses that are available in the draw and usually associated with a single tag. So this slide shows an overview of the allocation cycle for limited entry special license draws in Alberta that we go through each year for each license. We start this cycle each winter and spring in the information gathering stage. And the compilation of information is the cornerstone for the rest of the process, including the analysis of the information to develop an annual estimate of the population and also to inform the harvest approach. We then use the information analysis to determine the number of licenses to issue each year. And these licenses are available for hunters to apply for in a draw. I'm going to expand on how we calculate license opportunity with a specific example later tonight, but just want to go through this allocation cycle and get into the details of the first steps. So first, I'm going to focus on the information gathering step, which includes two critical components to the allocation process. Both aerial surveys and hunter harvest surveys provide information that is critical to the annual license allocation. Those are the cornerstones of the process. We're going to go into both of these in more detail in the next few slides. So in terms of information gathering, here's a list of some of the common information sources that help biologists determine harvest allocations and license numbers. In the last slide, I highlighted that aerial population surveys and hunter harvest surveys are critical to Alberta's allocation approach. They truly are the cornerstones of our process. These data enable precise estimates and allow us to be adaptive to changes in game populations. We use these data to calculate population and harvest estimates annually to determine the license numbers each year. We're going to expand on these two data sources shortly. In addition to these two primary data sources, we also rely on new research and science to inform our management approaches. So this includes the delivery of research, including collaboration and engagement with research institutes and agencies. The division is continuously reviewing and evaluating how we collect the information. And for example, we are regularly reviewing new approaches such as aerial survey techniques or remote camera approaches that might improve our program delivery. In addition to those things, we rely on public input and engagement to provide context for the other sources of information. This webinar series is one component of the stakeholder engagement that provides a direct line of feedback to biologists and other staff. Public input is incorporated into our adaptive management approach and harvest objectives for game populations. And this public engagement is critical to evaluating social tolerance for wildlife and hunters, to evaluate the supply and demand for opportunity, and the general desires and preferences of hunters in Alberta. So you've probably picked up on the theme that aerial surveys are important to our management approach in Alberta. A colleague uses a great analogy that aerial surveys are like sighting in a rifle. Even the best rifles need to be sighted in before the hunting season. We use aerial surveys as a way to re-sight or recalibrate our understanding of populations and our management approach. Alberta delivers one of the most advanced aerial ungulate survey programs in North America, and these surveys are critical to recalibrating our estimates and detecting changes in trend and ratios of sex and age over time in populations. Surveys also allow us to evaluate how our management approach is performing relative to our expectations. These surveys are vital to measure all of the sources of unknown mortality, such as predation, non-licensed harvest, and unexpected events such as winter die-off disease and winter tick events. The confidence in our preseason estimates is highest after a recent survey, and we prioritize surveys in areas where uncertainty is the greatest or where our management program is more active. We compiled a video here to just show you what it's like to fly an aerial survey. Our aerial surveys allow us to fine-tune our preseason population estimates, just like sighting in a rifle. Although it varies by species and landscape, the surveys are delivered in winter after the hunting season are mostly complete. We typically fly along a series of transects and count animals along the transect. And we use these counts to estimate the population density for one or many species, depending on the survey. We collect information on sex and age of each group. And you can see here, we're over top of some deer and we're classifying bucks, does, and fawns. And these surveys allow us to assess changes in populations across surveys and also allow us to assess changes relative to our management approach and expectations. This is from the Peace region, these videos here. So in addition to aerial surveys, the other most critical piece of information that we rely on is the hunter harvest surveys. And all hunters should be familiar with this because you fill this out each winter to report your activity from the previous hunting season. Hunters are often surprised to learn how critical this information is, and the mandatory reporting of harvest activities is extremely important to the calculation of next year's allocation. The hunter harvest reporting in the calculation of licenses is completed directly using the information from the hunter harvest surveys. And we're going to explore this more closely later in an example. While these data are necessary for calculating expected harvest success, they can also provide valuable information on the general trends in hunter efficiency, activity, and success across seasons. And this can relay some information about the populations themselves. So we just discussed the components of the information gathering step of the allocation process. And now we're going to dive into the information analysis stage that we complete each year. So each year we estimate what we call a preseason population estimate. This is the estimated number of individuals in a population just before the opening day of the hunting season. And the preseason is calculated, or rather the preseason is calibrated to the most recent aerial survey estimate that we have, but we use a variety of information to estimate changes in populations in years where no survey has been completed. The preseason population size is calculated by accounting for annual harvest, so how many were killed in the previous hunting season, and adjusting for changes in non-licensed factors such as winter severity or winter tick events. Each year we evaluate the management objective and apply the harvest objective or harvest rate to the preseason estimate to determine how many animals should be harvested each year. For example, we may want to lower the harvest rate to achieve older age classes, or alternatively, we may increase the harvest rate to avoid overpopulation in agricultural zones. The preseason population estimate is the estimated population size on opening day. Each year, biologists account for changes in a population from the previous year in a wildlife management unit. And this process estimates mortality, including licensed mortality directly from the hunter harvest surveys, so how many were killed the previous year under licenses, and also accounts for natural and unlicensed mortality. So examples of natural and unlicensed mortality are predation, poaching, disease, vehicle collisions, wounding, and constitutional harvest. In addition to mortality, we must account for the survival of calves that become bulls and cows each year. And we also account for the new crop of calves that are born into the spring and summer prior to the opening day. So we account for mortality and survival across the entire year. And this allows us to adjust our preseason population estimate annually rather than waiting for an aerial survey to adjust our population estimates. As we explored earlier, each new aerial survey allows us to recalibrate as necessary. And in the interim, we use as much non-survey information as possible to keep on top of changes in populations. So we've already gone over how we collect information and use it to estimate the objective harvest rate in preseason population estimates. Next, we're going to explore how we calculate the harvest goal, or the number of animals that can or should be harvested for the upcoming hunting year. I'm going to slowly walk through an example of how we calculate the number of special licenses to issue in the next series of slides. So this example is going to demonstrate the simple process of how the harvest objective is applied to a preseason population estimate to determine the number of special licenses to be issued. In this example, our harvest objective is to harvest antlered bucks at a rate of 10% of the total population. So that's our harvest objective. In this example, we use a population estimate of 2,000 deer. And remember, this is a preseason population estimate, which is the number of animals on opening day. In this hypothetical example, we use a harvest rate of 10% of the total pre-hunting season population estimate. And 10% is a nice round number and easy to track through the example today. So that's why we're using it. So with 2,000 deer in the population, 10% yields 200 bucks that can be harvested. So 10% is the harvest objective, and the harvest goal in this case is to harvest 200 bucks in the upcoming hunting season. Now that we know that our harvest objective is 200, we need to account for the other sources of harvest that will occur during the upcoming hunting season. In this case, we're going to include general archery licenses, outfitted non-resident licenses, and landowner licenses. The estimated harvest mortality is based on an average over the past several years. And in this example, we assume that the total number of harvested bucks from these sources is 50. So in other words, we estimate that a total of 50 bucks will be killed by archery, outfitting, and landowner licenses in the upcoming hunting season within this WMU. So what we do is we remove those 50 licenses from the 200 harvest goal licenses that can be made available, which leave, not licenses, bucks that can be made available, which leaves 150 bucks that can be allocated. So we don't know how many bucks are actually going to be harvested based on the number of licenses that we issue. But fortunately, we do. With the hunter harvest information that you provide, we calculate the average harvest success of each license that's been allocated, and we use that to adjust for the harvest objective. So on average, in this example, we're going to assume that for every license that's issued, half a buck gets shot, or rather for every 2 licenses that are issued, 1 buck gets harvested. So that's a harvest success rate of 50%. And when we apply this harvest success rate to 150 deer that are to be allocated, we calculate that 300 licenses can be made available. In this example, we know that not all hunters will be successful, and we issue 2 licenses for every deer that we expect to be harvested. The number of licenses issued depends on how successful hunters have been. And this information is calculated directly from the annual hunter harvest reporting that you provide at the end of each season. So that information is really important. And this information is critical, in fact, to the precise allocation of hunting opportunity each year. So that mandatory reporting directly informs how we get from our harvest objective to the number of licenses that we actually issue based on our anticipated harvest success in the upcoming hunting season. So as a recap, we multiply 2,000 deer in a population by a harvest rate of 10%, which makes for 200 harvests. This is our harvest goal. We remove 50 harvest opportunities that we estimate will be killed by other licensed harvests, which becomes 150 harvests that can occur. And remember, these are harvest opportunities, not the number of licenses that we issue. And to get the number of licenses that are available, we account for harvest success. So in this example, 150 harvests divided by 50% success rate generates 300 licenses, and that's expected to yield 150 harvested deer under the special license opportunity. This adjustment for harvest success is where the hunter harvest surveys directly inform the license allocation each year. So keep submitting that information because it's critical to this process. So this is just one example of how we typically calculate the number of licenses to issue each year for one opportunity type, but we repeat this process for all special license opportunities every year, which is a large number of allocations each year. So we've gone into some detail about the information gathering and analysis stages of the annual process. And the next step is to make these licenses available to eligible hunters in the special license draw that happens in spring. However, it's important to highlight that there are some realities to the timelines of calculating the license allocation. It takes time to compile the hunter harvest survey information, the aerial survey estimates, and to compile the updated preseason population estimates for every population in each WMU each spring. In addition, once special license numbers are calculated, there's a process of peer review and review by senior management before the allocations are made available for the hunting draw application. So it's important for hunters to understand that the timeline for information gathering and analysis is fairly narrow and occurs annually. So despite these limitations, our division's been working pretty hard to reduce these timelines. So it's our goal to report license numbers as early as possible to help hunters make informed decisions on their draw applications each year. And I'd say in the last 2 seasons, we've been fairly successful at improving those processes to make it possible. And most license numbers were posted within Realm early in the draw application period. And we're hoping to maintain and continually improve this information exchange and try to reduce that timeline as much as possible. So that concludes the presentation on how we allocate and determine the number of special licenses for the hunting draws. We focus tonight on the key principles of how licenses are calculated to provide a basic understanding of the fundamental principles of the allocation process. But there's definitely a lot of moving parts and considerations in each of the components that we didn't touch on today. But hopefully you're going to come away with a pretty decent sense of the basics of how we apply the allocation and translate that into licenses that are made available each year. Regular aerial surveys are critical to our allocation process, and these surveys calibrate our population estimates, which allow us to accurately allocate harvest opportunity and evaluate the performance of our harvest approach directly with little uncertainty. Hunter harvest surveys are used to directly translate the harvest objective goal into the number of licenses that are available each year. And biologists rely on the information that you provide directly on your hunter harvest questionnaires. We use that information every single year for every single license opportunity. So it's incredibly valuable. While we focus on the simple calculation of license opportunity, we can't fly surveys in all populations every year. And so we rely on forms of information to inform potential changes in populations other than aerial surveys. So biologists also use information from engagement with hunters and landowners to determine what the harvest objective is going to be in each area and to flag changes that may be required in the preseason population estimate. And it also helps us to prioritize a new survey with limited dollars to evaluate where those efforts can be best spent. We're pleased to be able to continue this important engagement with this webinar series, but we want to acknowledge that the ongoing engagement that biologists continue to deliver at the regional level is equally important. So there's a number of locations where you can find more information on the web about many of the things that we discussed. Robin's going to provide a list of the links in the chat as well, I believe. Alberta Realm, hopefully many of you are familiar with this and already using many of the advanced features. The features keep getting added annually, and it's quite impressive, the transition that's happened over the past few years within Realm to make it easier to apply on draws and to understand what the license allocation is, all in the same system. My Wild Alberta has a variety of information, including some of the older draw reports that won't be available in Realm. So if you're looking for anything, I think prior to about 3 years ago, you're going to have to go on the My Wild Alberta page and you see on the tab below the finger on the screen, there's the hunting draws. So you can find that information there. Aerial survey reports from the recently flown surveys over the past 6 or 7 years can be found on alberta.ca. The best way probably to find those rather than searching through the alberta.ca site is to just enter a search for aerial surveys Alberta in your Google search bar, and hopefully that'll be one of the top hits. So thanks for your attention tonight, and I'm going to pass it back to Robin to take us through the next part of tonight's program.
That was great. Thank you, Mike, for walking us through that allocation process and everything that goes into our recreational hunting licenses behind the scenes. So we are going to take the opportunity now to introduce you to our panelists tonight. So just a reminder, though, that our panelists are here to answer as many questions as they can. So if you haven't already, now is a really great time to open up that Q&A tool from your Zoom control panel and start typing in any questions you may have about how recreational hunting opportunities are derived and allocated in Alberta. Now, don't forget, I see some of you have started this already, but you can also upvote questions you'd like to hear an answer to as well by clicking on that thumbs up icon underneath each question. And as I mentioned before, this is really helpful to prioritize questions you want to hear answers to tonight and the order that we answer them in. So while you are starting to type in your questions there, let me introduce you to tonight's panelists. So on the line, we have Brett Buchel, Senior Wildlife Biologist, Rob Corrigan, Provincial Big Game Specialist, Justin Gilligan, Wildlife Biologist, Brian Joubert, our Manager of Licensing, Natalka Melnicki, Senior Wildlife Biologist, Mike, who you've already met, who is our Senior Wildlife Biologist as well, and Curtis Stamba, Wildlife Manager of Northwest Alberta. Also online tonight, we have some technical support behind the scenes from Jenna Curtis and Natalie Olson. And once again, my name is Robin, and I'll continue to facilitate tonight for the Q&A period. So I see we have some great questions coming in already. So let's move right into that. Our first question here comes from Brian. And Brian's asking, is there any thought to allow extra input in the hunter harvest reports? There are many reasons a hunter might not fill a tag. For example, a hunter may hunt many days and not take the animal because he is trophy hunting. This does not necessarily mean that the population is low, but a specific animal is sought. Other tags may have also been filled, providing sufficient meat, making filling remaining tags not as significant.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Brian. I'll take that one, and it's of particular interest to me. The simple answer is really that the harvest is the key metric there and the key number that we're after, knowing what the rate of hunter harvest is in those units. As Mike was just explaining, that's a key input into population estimates and then setting quotas for licenses. We ask the additional questions around the number of days hunted to get a trend in hunter effort or animal harvested per unit effort, and then also overall levels of satisfaction. But we understand that there's a lot of different motivations and expectations that hunters have. We could, through analysis, cross-tabulate, for example, your results where we see, you shot an elk this year and you didn't shoot a whitetail despite hunting for 5 days. Something like that would be an assumption that you were looking for decent antlers. That said, we do partner with some research agencies to get a better handle on hunter preferences, and it's certainly something we're going to be doing more of in the future. And I should add, the reason we keep it short is so that it's convenient for hunters to do, so that it's not a long slog to get through your harvest reports, but we get that critical information. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question is from another Brian. For antlerless elk and mule deer special licenses, in some zones, why are 2 tags given out to those that are drawn versus giving out 1 tag to more hunters? My experience has been that most of the second tags are never used.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for the question. So we typically will add 2 tags to 1 license on those special licenses that you mentioned, the antlerless elk or the antlerless mule deer, for 2 reasons. One is if a WMU is chronically undersubscribed, where not enough people are interested in going to hunt in that particular WMU, we will offer 2 tags to try to offer an incentive to get people to go into that WMU. And that happens quite often, more so with antlerless mule deer. A lot of people won't drive a long distance or a fair distance to go have an opportunity to hunt 1 doe, but given 2 does, they might. So that's one reason. But another reason why we do it has to do around hunter density. And in areas where access can be difficult, and we can't get the harvest, or we're just too many hunters, then we will offer 2 tags for 1 hunter. And you see that not only with antlerless elk and mule deer, but also on our military bases, where we want to get that harvest, but hunter numbers is an issue. So we'll offer 2 tags, and in Wainwright, actually 3 tags. So those are the 2 reasons. One is as an incentive to get hunters out there, which is what we do for antlerless mule deer. And you'll find that areas where we do issue the 2 tags for antlerless elk, it's typically in response to areas that are harder to get access. We don't do it very often. There's just a few zones that we do that, but that's the reason why.
Thanks, Rob. Our next question comes from Mike, and Mike is asking if those aerial survey videos are available to the public.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mike. I'll take this one. So we don't typically video record our surveys while we're flying. There's a lot going on during our surveys. Every observer on board is needed to record what we're seeing, to identify groups, to search for additional ungulates on the landscape. So really, it's just an opportunistic thing if we're getting videos of what we're doing. But we are happy to share more on social media if that's what folks would like to see. So thanks for your interest, and hopefully we'll get more of that online for you.
Thanks, Natalka. Our next question coming from Steve, and Steve's asking, what is going to be done to get fair access to leased land? Almost all of the leaseholders never answer or return phone calls.
Hi, I'll answer that question, Robin. So it's a good question. It is a little out of scope from what we're talking about today with allocation. And the actual access to our grazing leases is managed through our land staff and under the rec access regulation, which you can find online. If you are having trouble, I really encourage you, and I've often mentioned this in our local meetings, to please reach out to the land settlement officer and the local agrologist, because they're there to help deal with access issues. And so I'd encourage you to reach out. And not only does it, hopefully they can help mediate the access, but further, it helps us understand what the pressures are, and then we can work forward to help better deal with those in the future. So once again, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Brett, and sorry to cut you off there. Our next question's from Don. Don's asking, is constitutional harvest tracked? And if so, is reporting mandatory? If not, doesn't that negatively impact the ability to properly manage license allocation?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. It was a question that came up last week too at our other webinar, so I'll handle that one similarly to I think how I answered it last week. Hopefully, we don't track or we don't get any of the constitutional harvest reporting as a department, at least not yet. We're still working with communities here and there on that. But as Mike alluded to in his presentation, where every year annually we have to develop a preseason population estimate, he did mention that one category where we subtract some of the natural mortality, and he did mention constitutional harvest in that initial number that we develop every year to build on the arithmetic he talked about. So it depends on the WMU and the species, and we make some some judgment calls on what we would prescribe there. But bear in mind, the most important element of the allocation process to recalibrate our permits on a frequent basis are those aerial ungulate surveys. So that allows us to readjust and take stock of where we are and whether we need to increase or decrease those recreational opportunity allocations frequently enough that it usually works out quite well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Excellent. Thank you, Curtis. Dave is asking, why isn't there an option for successful draw applicants to return their draw back into the system and maintain their priority for next year? Occasionally, a situation develops that between the application process and the draw results, people find out that they're unable to use this draw. Having the option would give someone else an opportunity and help you reach your harvest goal.
Hi, thanks for that question, Dave. So it's kind of a complicated licensing system that we have that wouldn't really allow us to do that. It's by the time we run our draws and announce that our licenses are available, it's we're already on to other things in our licensing system, and to run another separate draw for licenses that are turned back really isn't feasible with our system, to be honest. And another reason is when people do apply and get drawn, we really want them to participate in the hunt and use that license. And we understand that at certain times in people's lives that they just can't. And that's, as Mike explained in his presentation, goes into the way that we do calculate permits. We do know that every year, a number of people that do get drawn can't hunt, and that goes into our calculations. And it's pretty stable year after year. I mean, the last time I looked at it was a few years ago, for example, for mule deer. And for mule deer bucks, we were finding about only 75% of the people were actually buying the license that were drawn. So that does go into our calculations, and those numbers the permits that we do issue do go up. So those numbers are taken into account. And unfortunately, for people that do get drawn and can't hunt for whatever reason, it is unfortunate, but our system just can't really handle a subsequent draw to reallocate those licenses.
Thanks, Rob. Jade is asking, why did the process for applying for an increase in priority change, and what was the rationale? You used to be able to apply increases for all animals. For example, we used to be able to apply for all moose species for increase, and now we can only apply for an increase for one specific draw per species. Was the change due to overall animal count?
Hi, Jay. Thanks for the question. I'm not 100% sure if I understand your question correctly, but I'll give it a go. I don't know about moose, whether there was a time when people could apply for all moose draws, bull, cow, and calves. In my time, that it hasn't been like that. I know it's been like that for quite a while. For moose, you can only apply for one, and the reason for that is just people really want the opportunity to hunt moose, and it's a really prized animal. And for example, bull moose or antlered moose is, apart from antlered mule deer, is the most popular draw that we have in Alberta. And a lot of people, all they want to do is hunt bull moose. And if we were to open up and let people apply for bulls, cows, and calves, that wait time for bulls would go way up. And a lot of people just want, their number one thing that they want to hunt is bull moose. So if we were to open up and let people apply on cows and bulls, you're going to get another, 20,000 people applying for bulls every year. And a lot of those people that do apply for bulls won't apply for cows. That's just the way that they are. So we limit that draw for moose to try to keep the wait times down for people that are trying to pursue one class or species or a sex of moose. The other species like antelope, we get asked, why can you apply for 3 antelope draws and only 1 moose? And I'm not sure history behind the antelope draws, that's probably 20, 30 years ago. And I don't know why the decision was made to allow that. It just was. And at this time, we're not looking at changing the limits for moose. You can still apply for both antlered and antlerless mule deer, all three types for antelope. Elk, there is limitations as to what you can apply for, and we are looking at that as trying to open that up a little bit. But at this time, we're not making we're looking at making any changes for moose.
Excellent, thanks, Rob. Our next question's from Gabriel, who's asking, in WMUs around reservations where First Nations have constitutional rights to hunt, how do you account for when allocating recreational harvest opportunities? What is the margin of error when counting game, especially in thick bush WMUs?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So it's kind of a two-part question there. So, Curtis had already gone over constitutional harvest, and our approach there is to evaluate preseason population estimates year to year and mortality, all sources of mortality associated with that. And related to your question, it's the same way that we would address that is from one survey to the next, you would see a difference in the population if there was overharvesting occurring. And so it's that touch point of looking at from one survey to the next and evaluating what the population trend is from one population nest to the next to evaluate if something's changed, if the mortality rates are higher between those 2 points. So we manage on a wildlife management unit basis. Our surveys are completed to get an estimate of the wildlife management unit, and they don't address the density within a smaller area within those WMUs typically. But that's typically how we deal with that is to use that survey information from one year to the next. And then the next question is the margin of error. And so the precision that we typically see does vary from survey to survey as it does in all jurisdictions, but it tends to be around 12% to 20% coefficient of variance, but from one survey to the next. And it varies by species as well. So there is a precision estimate as there is with any sampling or survey that's completed to address that. And in terms of thick bush WMUs, siteability is a factor and a concern. And so for deer and thick bush WMUs, it's very difficult to see them. We tend not to estimate or even attempt population inventories in heavy forested areas for deer. But moose are big-bodied animals. We tend to fly our surveys in cold temperatures where the moose tend to be more in the open, and siteability is at its peak typically when we're flying those. We tend to see somewhere between 100% to 80% in most areas where we fly moose, and we account for siteability error through various methods.
Great, thanks, Mike. Curtis is wondering where he can find the listing for species management areas.
I can take that question. Thanks for that question, Curtis. So if you're looking for a map or listing of the species management areas, the best place to find that is likely in the species management plans themselves. And if you're looking for a copy of those, you can find them by using the right Google search terms. And I recommend Alberta White-tailed Deer Management Plan or Alberta Mule Deer Management Plan, and that should get you on track.
Excellent, thanks for that, Justin. Mark's wondering, if you hunt on an island in the middle of a river, which WMU would that fall under?
I'll take that question, and thanks, Marcus. It's actually a really good question because many of us just quickly look at the WMU map we get each year without really thinking about some of the finer details of maybe sometimes where the WMU ends when it's not on a road. So the quick answer to this question is that you can look, and each WMU is described in quite a bit of detail within our actual wildlife regs. So if you search up wildlife regs and go to Schedule 9 of the regs, there'll be detailed descriptions within each, and it'll describe to the left bank going downstream, moving from bridge X as an example. And as long as your island is on before the left bank, you should be able to determine which WMU you're in.
Excellent. Thanks, Brett. Gordon's asking, have antelope numbers increased and will antelope wait times for draws be less?
I'll take another shot at that, answering that question as well. So before our antelope allocation occurs, we fly surveys each year to determine what our population is. And then on the basis of that survey, we are able to set up how many permits are issued each year. Overall, we've been finding that our antelope numbers have been quite stable in the last couple of surveys, and you should see about a similar number of tags, we assume, given out. Of course, we're going to fly it again this upcoming summer.
Great, thanks for that too, Brett. Gary says, hi folks, can someone let us know why supplemental whitetail tags have been started against this past season in the zones around the Hinton area? It seems over the past several years, the whitetail population was beginning to come back to a better population size after the supplemental tags had ended. Why bring this back in now, I am wondering. I've heard there might be a plan to limit whitetail in the eastern slopes and hope mule deer become more plentiful in numbers. Is this accurate? Thanks very much.
Yeah, I can try to answer that one. So whitetail deer supplemental licenses are an opportunity license. So, one license, two license throughout the province kind of provision enable hunters to, in addition to a general license, which can take either a buck or a doe, to hunt one or two additional does, depending on which wildlife management unit that you're in. And so the important thing to consider with whitetail deer populations is that the populations tend to fluctuate quite a bit, but are extremely robust, highly productive. Harvest rates tend to be much lower on whitetail deer than, say, something like mule deer. And the majority of that supplemental license availability actually results in very little harvest of that antlerless whitetail population. And in terms of big game populations, it's probably the closest big game population that you get what's called compensatory mortality, where hunting is not going to impact the population, and largely those populations are fluctuating based on severe winters. So it's the snow that changes whitetail deer populations, not the harvesting. And we've seen that over the years throughout Alberta. So those supplemental license opportunities are just to maximize opportunity for hunters, and the harvest associated with them is quite minimal.
Great, thanks, Mike. Kevin is asking, for the undersubscribed tags, why is this limited to only allow one tag purchased? For example, I buy a general bull elk tag and cannot buy an undersubscribed antlerless elk. If the allocation is there, is it because there are a certain number of animals that are desired to be harvested? Why not allow people to buy these tags even if they've already purchased a tag?
I can take that one. Thanks, Kevin, for the question. It's a very good question, especially up in the Northwest area where myself and Mike are found. This is a scenario that requires a few changes. So a regulation change where an individual could apply for 2 elk licenses at one time, as well as a change in our licensing system. So unfortunately, there isn't an easy way for us to make that change. And maybe if anyone wants to elaborate on that, they can. But it is something that we're looking into, because when we do have undersubscribed licenses, we'd prefer them to be taken up by folks that are already out there hunting and obviously have that need and desire to hunt those elk. So this is something that we are working on, and appreciate the question.
Excellent, thanks, Natelka. Josh is asking, is the number of active hunters increasing or decreasing, and at what rate?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, it's interesting. You may have seen some media reports about Alberta bucking some of the common North American trends in hunter participation. So the short answer is it's increasing in Alberta. We're not at our peak in the 1980s, where we were up to about 185,000, and then we dipped really low, well below 100,000 into the 90s. Alberta's seen a fairly steady increase, 5 to 10% per year. I mean, it sort of oscillates around an average, but the last 2 years we've sold licenses to about 150,000 hunters. So 2020 we thought was a bit of an anomaly. 2021 has proven to have just about the same amount of hunters. And one of the good news stories as well is female hunters have increased from about a steady 10% of the hunter population to now 15. So that's a fairly nice jump in the last 2 years.
Great, thanks for that, Brian. Okay, so Rick has a doozy of a three-parter for us regarding caribou recovery in the Grand Cache area. So question one, why were moose and elk shot from helicopters for wolf bait? Number two, why are wolves being poisoned by GOA when trappers have shown that they can kill more wolves more humanely and more cost effectively and use roadkill for bait? And number three, why are wolves the big scapegoat regarding caribou recovery when the increasing number of grizzly bear and cougars in their populations are killing caribou as well?
Okay, I'll try that. Sorry, okay, there's too much there. Could we just go back to the first question, Robin, and I'll try to answer them simultaneously.
Absolutely. So number one was, why were moose and elk shot from helicopters for wolf bait?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, this whole topic is a little bit out of scope for today's presentation. So this is what I'll say about the question. And I appreciate the answer because it's a sensitive topic. And you're right, Alberta is in the midst of caribou conservation and recovery throughout the province. We have numerous commitments, ministerial priorities. We have commitments with Canada to recover self-sustaining caribou populations in the province and across Canada for that matter. So there are a number of management actions that we take on an annual basis to deliver that work. Wolf control is one of those aspects. So is habitat reclamation, landscape planning, and the whole sub-regional planning process that Alberta is engaged with right now. So I think I'll leave it at that for today. And there's a lot more information that can be available at a different time than during tonight's presentation.
All right, Curtis, can I move right into question number two from Rick there?
Yeah, I think it's all about the caribou conservation, is it not? Let's see what the second one is, yeah.
So just to reiterate, so number two was, why are wolves being poisoned by the GOA when trappers have shown that they can kill wolves more humanely and cost effectively and use roadkill for bait? And then number three was, why are wolves a big scapegoat when it comes to a caribou recovery when there's other animals like grizzly bear and cougars who are killing them as well?
Okay, yeah, so again, I'll reiterate my first point in that wolves aren't the scapegoat. Wolves are, approximate cause for caribou decline. Caribou is the whole ecological web of caribou is a little off kilter right now with the landscape change, and wolves are approximate cause that are creating caribou, in near extinction rate or extirpation rates in certain ranges. So there is an aspect of management that needs to take place there. The second part of the question is, so I did mention we have a predator control program going. Oh, I know what it was, the trapping question. So there is a lot of evidence out there that at the rate that we need to remove wolves for caribou conservation and recovery isn't adequate through trapper harvest alone. So it does need to be at a much higher rate in order to achieve caribou recovery outcomes, and that is the reason why. One point that I will make on this question is that we do work with the Alberta Trappers Association to incentivize increased harvest by trappers in certain caribou ranges. So we do work with trappers to do that, and they're well-versed and quite supportive of the program.
Excellent, thanks, Curtis. Jamie's asking, can you please tell me why much of the province had so many whitetail supplemental tags this past season? Would taking so many antlerless deer not hurt the population in future years? Jamie, it seems like you've stumped our panel here, so I'll just reiterate the question. Can you please tell me why much of the province had so many whitetail supplemental tags this past season? Would taking so many antlerless deer not hurt the population in future years?
So
Oh,
I
sorry.
can.
Oh, go ahead, Mike. Yeah, please.
Yeah,
do.
no, it's kind of related to the previous one
Yeah.
anyway. So I'm not sure that the supplemental licenses in total in terms of sales would be different. Brian might know, but we probably won't know that till the spring when we get our hunter harvest questionnaire information back. So we're going to evaluate that for sure. You know, as I said earlier, whitetail deer populations are robust in mild winters. They have twins and triplets, and the population is very quick to recover. And we see that in agricultural areas of the province. And so a few strategies, one of which is to minimize the ability of those populations to grow to overpopulation in agricultural areas. And in other areas, which I think the earlier question was related to, it's to just provide opportunity, knowing that the harvest success is going to be quite low. So we evaluate trends in harvest success through time, and as one measure. In areas where we can get a reliable population estimate, we track those populations and evaluate the harvest approach, be it supplementals or otherwise. We haven't seen any indication that supplemental licenses negatively impact populations. It's the severe winters, and in terms of compensatory mortality, you tend not to harvest your supplementals when populations are on a downward trend, and when they're coming back up, you tend to. So,
great, thanks for taking that one, Mike. Gary is asking, actually Gary noticed this year that the mandatory head submission requirement for a large portion of the province was removed. Anecdotally, between a group of hunters he knows, they had 5 mule deer bucks come back positive for chronic wasting disease in 2020, only to find the WMUs they were harvested from are no longer mandatory submission zones in 2021. Is the prevalence of chronic wasting disease moving east or west? It seems the central portion of Alberta is no longer a mandatory submission.
Hi, Gary, thanks for the question there. We've had that question asked quite a bit the last couple of years when we removed a lot of those zones. And what we're finding, your second question had to do with, is it moving east or west? CWD is in prevalence and distribution is moving west and north in Alberta. It started on the east border with Saskatchewan, so it can't really go any further east because that's where it's coming from. So what we had to make a decision about where we were going to focus our testing, and we decided to try to put more effort into testing in the western WMUs, where it was either new or where we're thinking it might be found. And so we had to make a decision to not make some of those zones mandatory, just because our testing program and our labs just couldn't handle that many heads. We were at capacity for a couple of years, and by adding new WMUs to the west and north, we wouldn't be able to achieve the testing that we wanted to. So we had to make a decision, and we kept the mandatory zones along the east primarily for research. That's where we started our CWD program, and we have long-term trend data on CWD in the east. And in order to allow testing in the west and into the north, we had to make a decision to drop the mandatory head submissions in a lot of central Alberta.
Thanks, Rob. Steve says there's lots of new research showing hunting mature bucks and bulls affects the overall genetics of the herd. For example, smaller overall genetics of that single herd. So with this new research, would it make sense to have more WMUs allowing antlerless elk hunting versus the typical 3-point or larger?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for the question. There is a lot of research on genetics and the effects of hunting on genetics, and we feel that the pressure that we have on our elk by hunting 3 points and a lot of those zones, it's really not having the level of harvest that would cause genetic harm. And your question about allowing more antlerless elk versus typical 3 point is a really good question. And those 3 point zones are typically general for elk. Well, we might have some where it's a special license, but our special licenses for antlerless elk, we're trying to, limit or the harvest to a harvest goal, a defined harvest goal, whereas where we're hunting the 3 pointer better, it's a general season. And so, like I said, with our 3 point seasons, we don't feel that with the pressure that we're putting on the bulls that it's going to cause genetic harm.
Thanks, Rob. Rod is asking, as residents, we have to apply in the draws and have to increase priorities to get drawn up to 4 or 5 years for mule deer, bucks, and 12 years for antelope, and 5 to 12 years for a bull moose, when one person that is not from Alberta can harvest one of each every year if they wanted to. Why are non-residents and non-resident aliens not also put on some type of draw or limited to how often they can harvest each species, such as one mule deer buck every 3 or 4 years, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thank you, Rod, for the question, and it's a very good one. I think it's important to note that draw wait times increase as really a function of supply and demand. So as I said earlier, hunter numbers have increased in Alberta. So where there's a relatively stable population or quota each year, for argument's sake, your draw times will go up. From a non-resident point of view, someone could hunt one of those species every year if hunting on an outfitter's allocation, which is set at 10% of harvest at a species management area. Non-resident Canadians can participate in our draws for antlered game of certain species and for some other licenses. They need to be hosted. To give you an idea of that level of pressure, I was just looking the other day for antlered elk, mule deer, and moose in a year like 2019. Hosted non-residents were 1 to 2% of the license volume that residents bought, and about in most years 2 to 2.5% of resident hunters will host someone. So some of my colleagues had run an analysis a few years ago and showed that in many of those draws, if we, for example, cut all non-residents in the draw, we would maybe increase wait times by about a year for a lot of those. And we have those programs so that people can hunt with friends and family from out of province, and we have some sort of reciprocal relationship with other Canadian jurisdictions. That's for Canadian non-residents. That said, we do engage with the hunting public on these questions and how we can manage these, and we often welcome ideas for how to regulate and license these types of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Shannon's asking, how often is an aerial survey done per WMU?
I can take this one. Thanks, Shannon, for your question. So we aim to fly every wildlife management unit once every 5 years. That's an interval that can be shortened or lengthened depending on what we're seeing from hunter harvest success or hearing about drastic population changes within the unit. On the other hand, it sometimes we have a finite time of winter months in which we can fly these surveys. And we can't always get to every unit that's up for being flown. So provincially, we do have some pretty good discussions of which WMU should be flown for that, or which WMUs, plural, should be flown in this year. And we prioritize the ones that are of highest importance and typically have the most allocations that come out of them. Yeah, so we aim for every 5 years, but sometimes that's shorter and sometimes that's longer depending on different circumstances.
Excellent, thank you, Natalka. Dave is asking, what margin of error do you factor in on hunter surveys?
Thank you, Dave. you have stumped me well and thoroughly. I don't know. Maybe some of my colleagues know, but I would say I should know that level of error. Moving to mandatory harvest surveys for special licenses was an attempt, and a good one, to increase accuracy of those. For certain licenses and species, there would be more error. For some birds, for example, we do urge hunters, for example, for birds to maybe keep a personal hunt log, as I, like many other hunters, have got into November or December and gone, how many ducks did I shoot on September 12th? It helps to record that. And I will say, we have seen on the forums, for example, people sort of want to game the surveys. There's just no benefit in that at all. As Mike was saying, this is critically important information. This is all our wildlife. We're the owners of this wildlife. Let's provide good data to biologists to make these decisions. So yeah, harvest surveys are critical, and we hope that people fill them out accurately. Thanks.
Excellent. Kent is asking, does Alberta Environment and Parks work with First Nations and Métis for annual harvest reports?
Yeah, another good question, Kent. It's a question that everyone wants to know for sure, and I think I alluded it in my other answer here. Was we don't currently have records from constitutional harvesters, particularly First Nations. I mean, there's a lot of work that we need to do locally, community, First Nation to First Nation. It's not necessarily a provincial level endeavor in order to do that. And of course, we work with these communities on a variety of levels. One of the backdrops shouldn't be a surprise, but there's a trust issue built up over quite some time in terms of some of the information that First Nations will share with us. But it's something that we do want to work towards to get a better understanding of that. In regards to the Métis harvest agreement that Alberta initiated a number of years ago, there's still a dialogue being had with the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Settlements Council to see if we can build upon some of those the reporting and the discussions and how that whole agreement is going to roll out and how it's going to be tracked and going forward. So there's still dialogue to be had, but at this point in time, we don't have those records.
Excellent, thank you, Curtis. Our next question is from Brian. Because of allocation by species management area, are there many WMUs where outfitters have more antlered moose allocations than resident hunters? This should be changed, and in areas where resident priority requirements for any species get above a certain level, is there any consideration to greatly restrict outfitter allocations?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for the question. I believe you asked this question or something similar last week, and I'll try to, say the same answer as last week so I don't contradict. But you're right. There is some WMUs where outfitters currently do have more allocations or as many allocations as resident hunters, and we are typically. We do these 5-year reviews where we try to balance that out by the species management area. And we haven't done a 5-year review in a number of years, and we are due to do that. And it has been delayed for a number of reasons. And we are committed to doing another 5-year review with outfitter allocations and trying to balance out some of those areas that are frankly out of balance at the moment. Your second question is has to do with limiting outfitter allocations in WMUs for species where resident priority requirements have increased. And at this time, we're not looking at making that change. As Brian mentioned earlier, our hunter numbers are going up, and there is more demand, and frankly, resident priority is increasing, throughout Alberta for a lot of species. And if we were to limit outfitter allocations to areas where resident numbers or priority was increasing to a certain level, the outfitting industry would take a big hit, and we're not looking at doing it doing that right at this moment. We do recognize that it is certainly an issue for a lot of for resident hunters, and the outfitting industry is working with us to try to dilute lessen some of those impacts, and we are committed to doing that. But at the moment, there's nothing in place to do a 5-year review in the next little while. We hope to get that on track once this COVID thing is behind us and our borders are opened and everything gets a little bit back to normal. That all plays into it for sure as well. So we do recognize that this is a real pinch with resident hunters, and it's a we are committed to working with outfitters as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. We have a few folks interested in grizzly bears here, so we'll try to lump a few of these questions together. So what is the population trend for grizzlies right now in the province? Is there a key number that we want to hit before we start to allow hunting again? And when is that grizzly hunt coming back?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Josh, and everyone else who's submitted some grizzly bear questions here. So I'll try to answer this holistically. For those who attended last week's presentation again, Travis Ripley, our executive director, provided an answer that pretty much sums up where we're at with grizzly bears right now. We have an updated recovery plan that was posted on our website from 2020. There's an addendum to that most recently that has an updated population estimate. I think the number is 972, but again, these are point-based estimates, so they do change from year to year, obviously, depending on the area. But to answer the question about when is the hunt coming back, that's still a little bit of a discussion point into the future. What I think our department is committing to is doing a status assessment as a result of some of this new census information that we've gathered over the last little while. And from there, we need to make the decision on what the next management steps are. And if that involves a hunt, then the decision will be made.
Great answer. Thanks, Curtis. Our next question is from Gabriel. Generally speaking, is the goal to grow the population of a specific game or reduce it? I guess what I'm asking is, how do you decide how many moose, for example, are allowed to live in specific WMUs?
I can handle that question. Thanks for that one, Gabriel. So that's a really good question. And it sort of depends on the WMU and where the population is at. So we have broad WMU population goals that we manage for. And if our population is below goal, then we're going to be taking harvest back to a very smaller number than it would be if we were trying to maintain it. And if our population is considerably over goal, we may be increasing our harvest rates to try and manage back towards that goal. And in determining, what that goal is, some of the major considerations we have are both the biological carrying capacity and the social carrying capacity. So looking at what the landscape can and the habitat can handle for moose or whichever species we're discussing, and also what the tolerance is with the landowners and the other considerations from the human perspective. Thanks for that question.
And thank you, Justin. Dion is asking, so as a First Nation from Siksika, my question is, some tribes have big game hunting and allows them to invite non-members to hunt for antlered game. I did apply for and receive Alberta's shooting ground license for farm-raised pheasant a few years ago. We have invited non-members to hunt migratory and upland game birds on Siksika lands and are now exploring the possibility of applying for big game hunting with a bow.
Hi, Dion. I'll try to maybe not answer directly, but we can definitely work on following up. So I'm really glad to hear that you're been able to get a shooting ground license. I think that's excellent. And with the big game, because it's specific to Siksika, I'm going to ask that maybe you follow up with us a little bit after this presentation, and we can work and figure out exactly how best to work with you and figure out what might work for your particular situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Tim is asking, has there ever been a situation where the initial surveys have proven inaccurate?
I can take that. So thanks, Tim. I assume that means aerial surveys that you're asking about. And have they proven inaccurate after we flew a subsequent survey? So I don't know if I can answer that exactly, not understand exactly what you're asking, but I will say that we, when we estimate populations through aerial surveys, we estimate precision. So that's sampling error associated with the estimate. And we also design the surveys such that we have pooled robustness, so the large number of samples across a broad geographic area, and to measure the pattern of precision, differences in densities, for example, across the whole wildlife management unit when we fly the surveys, which gives us a better indication of that margin of error precision that we're using. And they tend to be fairly reliable. So it's pretty rare that we are surprised. And when we are surprised, it's often associated with an event that we either expected or were somewhat aware of. So I can't think of any off the top of my head, I guess. It may have occurred, but I'm not aware of them. But we do measure precision, and we're very mindful of evaluating that. But yeah, good question.
Thanks, Mike. Devin's asking that in the absence of aerial surveys, do wildlife managers attribute a high hunting effort and low harvest success to a low species population and thereby a reduction in subsequent allocations?
Maybe I can answer that one too. So for sure, so the hunter harvest information and things like harvest success, number of days hunting to kill an animal on average, those sorts of metrics that we do derive and review annually on our hunter harvest information is useful, but we don't use it as a guide in isolation because it can change for a number of factors. So it's very common that hunter harvest success is poor one year and it's exceptional the next year and it's poor the next. So it's quite variable. We do use 5-year averages, and we do look at those annually to particularly in units where we think there might be something to be concerned of, or we've heard concerns, or if we're trying to evaluate patterns that of things like, was the tick event severe, was our adjustment to a preseason population estimate, assuming that the winter die-off was significant, is that being realized in the hunter harvest success, things like that. So we do evaluate that, but we wouldn't dramatically change typically from particularly 1 year of difference in hunter harvest success. It would be, cumulatively 5 years, and probably by the time that we'd be making those changes, we would have prioritized an aerial survey. Typically, that's what the case, if it was a dramatic change, but. Yeah, so it wouldn't be a drastic change, but we do use the information, but it wouldn't be directly applied and associated with a decrease in licenses unless there are other factors associated with it.
Thanks for that, Mike. Tim's asking, are you limiting the number of guide and outfitter tags to 15% by FMU? And if not, why not?
Hi, Tim. I believe you mean WMU, not FMU. So I'm going to answer it by WMU. So are you limiting the number of guide and outfitter tags to 15% by FMU? If not, why? Typically, we try to have the outfitter harvest as limited to 10% of the harvest by WMU or by species management area. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some instances where it is higher than 10% now, and it is, a fair bit higher than 10%. That is our goal, from a species management area. And so, if not, why? So, like I mentioned before, we have 5-year reviews for outfitter tags, and the reason we do that is so that there's some stability in the outfitting industry, that they're able to know what their number of allocations are going to be for a period, so they can sell hunts 1, 2, 3 years out. And often the resident tags will fluctuate during that 5-year period, which puts that 10 to 15% out of whack. And that's what's happened. And that's why we need to do a review and rebalance that. And so if not, why? And the answer is because we let outfitters have some stability by having those known allocations for a period of years, so that they're able to have some business stability, and resident numbers can go up and down during that 5 years. So it is some years residents have a lot more than that 80 or 90% if populations are healthy, and other years they don't.
Great, thanks, Rob. Sander has asked our next question. Why are some aerial surveys done in February and March when the bucks are losing their antlers, and therefore the buck to doe ratio of the survey is questionable and should not be used in any calculation for population stratification?
I can answer Sandra's question. Thanks for that question. So yeah, the deer males, bucks, typically lose their antlers sooner than some other species, but we do have species like moose that we can tell the sex without antlers after the antlers have cast. So we do our best to try and prioritize WMUs that manage for deer first and foremost over the WMUs where we manage for moose, for example. And we try to fly these surveys as soon as we can. Sometimes we even get out in December when it's possible. But oftentimes we're facing constraints, in particular around the weather and the snow conditions, because we need to make sure that those are optimal for us to fly and be able to detect the animals and get a good survey executed. And so that's oftentimes can keep us from flying when we'd like to. But that said, we do typically wrap up our big game population surveys in about February every year.
Excellent, thanks, Justin. Jamie is asking, does the rationale for the whitetail supplemental tags increase this season have anything to do with attempting to eliminate chronic wasting disease and or COVID-19?
Hi, Jamie, thanks for the question. So I can answer the one about COVID really easy, and know the increases to our supplemental the areas where supplemental tags were used this year has nothing to do with COVID. The information coming out about COVID in deer is really new, and we have there's no research on what that actually means to deer populations or human health. We don't have any idea how it's transmitted between deer and humans and whatnot. So those decisions had nothing to do with COVID. There are some of the WMUs where we did implement the supplemental tags this year were in response to CWD in an effort to try to slow the spread and the distribution and prevalence of CWD. So yes, that was part of the reason. But as Mike alluded to before in some of the questions, that the harvest in the supplemental tags really isn't that high in a lot of areas and doesn't have a large impact on the population. But we, like I said, we did implement that in a number of areas, a lot of those WMUs in response to our CWD program, but nothing to do with COVID.
Great, thanks for clarifying that one, Rob. Brett is asking, provincially, the definition of an antlered ungulate is having an antler at least 4 inches in length. In WMUs having a general elk season, would it make any difference in overall bull elk harvest if the 3-point elk criterion was dropped to allow any bull elk with an antler over 4 inches to be harvested?
So good question, and thanks for that. I'll take a stab at answering it, and I'll let my panelists feel free to contribute as well. So yeah, generally speaking, our 3-point is designed to harvest males at about 2.5 years of age. And if you drop that to, a spike of 4 inches, we're absolutely going to open it up to allow more harvest. But it kind of depends, what are we trying to do, and what is our goal and objective, as some of the other panelists have said earlier.
Yeah, can I just add something to there? Yeah. So a lot of the areas where we have that 3-point bull, it is to allow, a good maximum sustained harvest and provide a lot of opportunity for elk hunters. And we do find at the end of the season in some of those areas that there's not a lot of 3, 4, 5-point bull elk running around. And if we were to drop that restriction down to any antlered bull on a general season, there would be probably an impact down the road with our pregnancy rates in elk. As Brett mentioned, a 3-point bull is typically a 2.5-year-old bull, and when they're harvested, there is some bulls. If they're harvested, before the rut, there's usually bulls left around that can do breeding, and we're finding that the pregnancy rates are still high in a lot of those areas. But if we were to drop it to just an antlered elk on a general season, chances are that we would have our pregnancy rates would drop and our populations would decrease, and there really wouldn't be a lot of bulls left post hunting season. And so even like in the 3-point zones, there's not a lot of really big bulls surviving, and to the next year. And if we were to drop that down to any elk, there wouldn't be a lot of bull elk left after the hunting season. And we do use just an antlered elk season, but it's with special licenses. I'm not aware of any general seasons where we have just any bull on a general season.
Excellent.
Thanks, Rob.
Yes, and thanks to our panelists for tag teaming that one. Our next question comes from Dennis. Dennis is asking, are Hutterite colonies allowed to conduct paid hunting opportunities for hunters with tags, or are the colonies required to have an outfitter or guide license?
Sorry, I was busy answering the last question when this one popped up. So are Hutterite colonies allowed? So Hutterites, Hutterites or non-Hutterites are allowed to conduct paid hunting on land. There'd be nothing to prevent a Hutterite colony or a member of a Hutterite colony, a resident of a Hutterite colony, to become an outfitter or a guide and offer that service, but they can't charge outside of the guiding and outfitting industry for paid hunting, just like any hunter can or any landowner can. But they are certainly allowed if they meet the criteria to become an outfitter or a guide. And if they are an outfitter, they could hold allocations for that colony for sure. Or not for the colony, but in a WMU that their colony resides in.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. And folks, that's a wrap on our Q&A session this evening. So before we call it a night here, we do have a few resources we'd like to share with you. But before we get into that too, thank you again for participating this evening and for bringing forward all of those great questions. The goal of tonight was to start this conversation about hunting and wildlife management here in Alberta. And it seems like we've done just that. So all of the questions that were received tonight will be reviewed for consideration and to inform future work of Environment and Parks. So tonight, as you leave this webinar, you will be redirected to a survey that you can provide feedback on how tonight's session went in your opinion. And we do hope to build off the momentum started here tonight and keep this dialogue going with you. So if any of your questions didn't get answered or you'd like to follow up on anything, you can do so by actually sending an email to that link or that email on screen, aep-outreachservices@gov.ab.ca, and we will be sure to follow up there. Now, if you're just looking for some more information, there's a few different places you can go. So first and foremost, if you're not already following My Wild Alberta on Facebook, that is a great tool that Environment and Park staff use to share information about hunting, as well as angling and trapping, and updates on work or ongoing projects that they are carrying out either with the department or also projects that include partners too. So that's another place as well that you can connect with any of our panelists tonight. If you wanted to just send a direct message through Facebook, we will be sure to follow up there as well. And as Mike mentioned earlier, we also have 3 sites online where you can find information there. So any of these can be found through a quick Google search, but again, they are alberta.ca, so that's where you can find those cool aerial survey results from the video that we saw here. albertarealm.com, which is where most of you, if you are hunters on the line tonight, have gone to purchase your licenses in the past. So lots of good information up there as well. And last but not least, mywildalberta.ca has lots more hunting information, and as well as information about wildlife management, hunter safety, and opportunities to ask questions too. So the other thing I will mention that's housed on that site is a recording of last week's webinar, and tomorrow morning a recording of tonight's webinar will be there as well. So you can go to mywildalberta.ca to check that out, or you can also use the link that I just shared in the chat, which will take you directly to Alberta Environment and Parks YouTube channel there. So I do want to mention too that we rely on hunter reports quite a bit, not only your harvest reports, but reports of suspicious or illegal hunting activity, as well as dangerous wildlife encounters. So please continue to report those to Report a Poacher. Reporting these incidents really helps us ensure that everyone's having as safe and enjoyable experience out there as possible, whether they're hunting or enjoying the land through any other activities as well. So with that, I will say thank you one more time for sharing your evening with us tonight, and we look forward to connecting with you more so about these topics in the future. Thanks everybody, and have a great night.